They say the Appalachian Mountains hold secrets older than the trees themselves. Stories of strange disappearances, shadowy figures, and unsettling whispers have long been passed down by those brave or foolish enough to traverse their lonely trails. This is the story of one such hiker, Emily, whose harrowing journey turned a peaceful trek into a living nightmare. Emily was an experienced hiker, a lover of solitude, and a seeker of nature's untouched beauty. At 28, she had spent years exploring trails across the United States, but the Appalachian Trail was her ultimate goal, a challenge she'd been dreaming of since her teenage years. That summer, she decided to hike a section of the trail, starting in Georgia and planning to end in Virginia. Excitement buzzed in her voice when she told me, her closest friend, about her plan. We spent weeks preparing, meticulously packing her gear and mapping out her route. I promised to meet her at a designated point, a backcountry lodge in the Great Smoky Mountains, where we'd hike together for a few days. She set off in early June, full of hope and determination. For the first few weeks, she kept in touch through postcards, cheerful notes assuring me she was safe and making good progress. But then, as July approached, something shifted. I received her last postcard on July 2nd. She was excited, on schedule, and looking forward to our meetup at the lodge on July 7th. But when the day came, Emily never arrived. I arrived at the lodge with my boyfriend Daniel, who had joined me for the hike. The sun was already sinking behind the jagged peaks, casting long shadows across the forest. The air felt unusually heavy, almost oppressive, as if the mountains themselves were watching us. At first, we assumed Emily was running late. We checked in with the lodge staff, but no one had seen her. Still, we tried to stay optimistic, reasoning that delays happen on such a grueling trail. But as night fell and Emily still hadn't shown up, unease crept in. The lodge, typically bustling with hikers sharing stories and laughter, felt eerily quiet. Even the crackling fire in the common room did little to dispel the growing sense of dread. When Emily didn't arrive the following morning, panic set in. We alerted the rangers, and a search party was organized. Days turned into a week with no sign of her. I was consumed by guilt and fear, imagining the worst. Then, almost 10 days after her disappearance, they found her, bruised, starving, and trembling in a ravine 30 miles off the trail. When I visited Emily in the hospital, she looked like a shadow of the vibrant person I once knew. Her eyes were hollow, her voice barely above a whisper. For weeks she refused to talk about what had happened. Only years later did she finally open up to me, and what she told me still haunts my dreams. "It started on June 30th, she began, her voice trembling. I was making good time that day, feeling strong and confident. Around mid-afternoon, I stopped for a snack and to rest my feet. That's when I first heard them. Voices. Men's voices." She paused, her eyes darting nervously as if the memory alone might summon them back. They were faint, somewhere off in the distance. I assumed it was just other hikers, but no one ever appeared. The voices seemed to drift in and out, like they were carried on the wind. It was strange, but I convinced myself I was imagining things. I'd been alone for weeks after all. Emily continued on her way, reaching her campsite just as the sun dipped below the horizon. She set up her tent, secured her belongings, and settled into her sleeping bag with a book. That's when the voices returned. They were closer this time, she whispered. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but their accents were thick, Appalachian. I kept waiting to hear footsteps, the crunch of leaves, something to indicate hikers nearby. But there was nothing, just the voices circling my campsite like ghosts. She forced herself to sleep, but the next morning brought more unsettling discoveries. Food wrappers were scattered across the ground, ripped open. Her backpack, which had been securely zipped, was tampered with. There were no animal tracks or scratches. As the days went on, the voices became her constant companions. They followed her, always just out of sight, mocking her with their eerie persistence. No matter how fast she walked or how many times she looked over her shoulder, she never saw anyone. On the night of July 3rd, Emily made the desperate decision to hike through the night, hoping to lose whoever, or whatever, was stalking her. But as she stopped to rest in a small clearing, the voices found her again. This time, they weren't disembodied whispers. "There she is!" a deep voice growled, sending icy terror down her spine. Emily spun around, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. Two men emerged from the shadows, filthy, unshaven, and wild-eyed. Their clothes were little more than rags, and their faces twisted into predatory grins. "I ran," Emily said, her voice breaking. "I didn't think, I just ran." She sprinted through the forest, the men chasing after her. Their bare feet pounded the ground, their ragged breaths growing louder with each step. For 2 weeks, Emily hid in the wilderness, surviving on scraps of food and dirty stream water. The men were relentless, their voices haunting her at every turn. Sometimes she would catch glimpses of them through the trees, watching, waiting. "They were like animals," she whispered. "Their eyes, I'll never forget the way they looked at me, like I was prey." She later discovered that the men were part of a group known as the Wild Men Criminals, who hid in the Appalachian Mountains to evade the law. Emily never hiked again. The mountains she once loved became a source of nightmares, and the sound of distant voices still makes her blood run cold. The Appalachian Trail is beautiful, yes, but it's also vast, remote, and unforgiving. So if you ever find yourself walking those ancient paths, remember Emily's story, because the wild men are still out there, hiding in the shadows, waiting, and they're always watching. It was June, deep in the wilderness of the Appalachian Trail near Blackwater Falls, West Virginia. Kate and her boyfriend Dylan, along with their loyal dog Max, were camping near the river. The day had been long and exhausting. They'd spent hours kayaking through the rough waters, narrowly avoiding dangerous currents. By the time they returned to their campsite, the tension in their bodies was as heavy as the humid evening air. Their site was isolated, tucked just 10 feet from the trail, with the river's gentle gurgling as their constant backdrop. The setting sun cast long shadows through the dense forest, and as the twilight deepened, the world grew eerily quiet. To unwind, they indulged in a few edible treats and settled into the calming rhythm of nature. Dylan dozed lazily in his hammock, while Kate lay on a towel near the riverbank, letting the cool breeze kiss her skin. It was then that he appeared. A man emerged from the shadowed trail, his figure obscured by the dim light. He wore a dusty backpack and an Appalachian Trail t-shirt, his face hollow and weathered. At first he seemed harmless, just another hiker passing through. But as he approached, his disheveled appearance and manic energy put Kate on edge. "Mind if I leave some trash with you?" the man asked abruptly, his voice strained, as if he hadn't spoken to anyone in days. Kate blinked in confusion, glancing toward the trailhead. Civilization, complete with dumpsters, was only a short walk away. She hesitated, trying to keep her tone polite. "There's a bin just down the trail, it's not far." The man didn't seem to hear her. Instead, he rummaged through his pack and pulled out a large bag of weed. A crooked smile spread across his face. "How about I trade you some of this if you take the trash?" Kate's instincts told her to refuse, but her curiosity and the promise of free weed got the better of her. Sure." "Why not?" she replied, forcing a nervous laugh. She handed over the trash bag and accepted the nugs, hoping this would end the interaction, but it didn't. The man lingered, muttering about his journey on the trail and asking if he could hang out. Kate's unease deepened, but she didn't want to appear rude. She reluctantly agreed, though she couldn't shake the feeling that he was there because he thought she was alone. When Dylan stirred in the hammock and sat up, the man's reaction was telling. His eyes widened in surprise and his demeanor shifted. He began over-explaining, repeating things like, "I'm not one of those creepy guys, don't worry." The reassurance only made him seem more suspicious. As they chatted, the man's behavior grew increasingly bizarre. He accepted their offer to smoke by the river, but after a single hit, he spiraled into erratic, disjointed muttering. He spoke in a low, almost inaudible tone, staring at the river as if entranced. Occasionally, he would turn to Kate and Dylan, as though they were part of a conversation he was having in his head. Then came the question that sent chills down Kate's spine. "On a scale of 1 to 10, the man asked, his tone casual but his eyes unblinking, "how much do I seem like a serial killer?" Time seemed to freeze. Kate and Dylan exchanged a tense glance, their minds racing. They forced nervous laughs, brushing it off as a joke. "Oh, 1, Dylan said, his voice strained. The man didn't laugh, he just stared at them, a crooked grin on his face. The atmosphere turned suffocating. The man chain-smoked cigarettes, each one feeling like it lasted an eternity. He mumbled incoherently, occasionally yelling at Siri on his phone, calling her names as though she were a real person who had wronged him. Finally, he announced he'd be leaving after one last cigarette. But even as the glowing ember of his smoke burned shorter, he lingered. Kate and Dylan climbed into the hammock, whispering to each other, their dog Max unusually quiet at their feet. Every passing second felt like a lifetime. When the man finally packed up and trudged off into the gathering darkness, they didn't relax. They knew he wouldn't go far, not with nightfall approaching. Their minds raced with worst-case scenarios. What if he came back? What if he wasn't alone? They planned an escape. If he returned, they'd grab Max and leap into the river, letting the current carry them downstream to safety. They lay awake, listening intently to every sound, every rustling leaf and snapping twig. Though the man never returned, the sense of his presence lingered an oppressive weight in the darkness. When they finally broke camp the next morning, Kate and Dylan couldn't shake the feeling that the stranger's intentions had been far from innocent. Sometimes it's not the wilderness that's dangerous. It's the people hiding in its shadows. And as they drove away from the Appalachian Trail, leaving the haunting silence of the woods behind, one thought lingered in their minds. They had seen the man's face, but what had he seen in them? I grew up deep in the shadowed heart of southern Appalachia, where the air always seemed to hum with ancient secrets. My family's house stood at the edge of a remote hollow, 40 minutes from the nearest town, a place untouched by time. The Appalachians, with their rolling hills and dark forests, were said to be among the oldest mountains on Earth. Whispers claimed they were here before even terrestrial life existed, and with such age came inexplicable phenomena, some benevolent and others not. This story isn't about those gentle oddities like the soothing warmth that lingered in the abandoned chapel near my family's property. No, this is about something far darker, something that felt older than the mountains themselves, something malevolent. It happened a decade ago when I was a 23-year-old student attending night classes at a nearby community college. I worked part-time during the day, so I'd drive home around 10:30 every evening. My ride was an old '74 Dodge pickup, battered but dependable, and I always took the same back roads to get home. The dark woods lining those roads were familiar to me, almost comforting. But one Thursday night, everything changed. I'd just taken the exit off the highway when the atmosphere seemed to shift. The hum of crickets and frogs, a constant companion on my drives, suddenly stopped. The silence was suffocating, pressing down like an unseen weight. Something was wrong. As I turned onto the narrow road toward home, I noticed the gas station by the exit was completely dark. Odd, since it was a 24-hour truck stop that never turned off its lights. Shrugging it off as a power outage, I continued driving, but the unsettling feeling only grew. The stars above, usually so bright and clear in the Appalachian night, were nearly invisible. It was as if the sky itself had gone into hiding. Then I saw it. It darted out of the trees and into the road, no more than 10 feet in front of me, a massive, sickly-looking dog. My heart slammed against my ribs as I stomped on the brakes, tires screeching in protest. The truck shuddered to a halt, and for a moment the world was still. The stench hit me next. A foul, choking odor of rotting flesh that seemed to seep into my very soul. I sat frozen, gripping the wheel, trying to convince myself it was just a stray. I put the truck in reverse, intending to back up and see if the animal was still alive. That's when I saw it in my rearview mirror, and my blood ran cold. The dog wasn't on all fours anymore. It stood upright, towering at least 10 feet tall. Its emaciated frame was covered in patches of mangy fur clinging to gray, sagging skin. Its limbs were grotesquely long and mismatched, the arms hanging low like a marionette controlled by some twisted hand. The thing turned its head toward me, and for the first time I saw its face. It wasn't a dog. It wasn't a man. It was something in between, yet wholly alien. Its face was a shifting nightmare, its features blurred as if refusing to take a permanent shape. Deep, hollow sockets stared where eyes should have been, and its mouth. God, its mouth. Teeth jutted out at impossible angles, too many to fit inside, as if they were trying to escape its jaw. The sight of it paralyzed me. For what felt like an eternity, the creature stared directly at me, its eyeless gaze piercing through the mirror as if it could see my soul. Then a porch light flickered on at a nearby house, and the thing snapped its head toward the light. With a guttural snarl, it dropped to all fours and bolted into the woods, its movements impossibly fast and disturbingly unnatural. I didn't think. I slammed the truck into first gear and floored it, tires spinning as I tore down the road. When I reached home, I locked every door, loaded my shotgun, and sat in the dark basement, shaking. My parents were asleep upstairs, blissfully unaware of the terror lurking outside. Even the family dogs, who barked at everything, were silent that night. Around 3 a.m., just as I was starting to drift off, the stench returned. It was faint at first, but soon it filled the entire basement, choking and oppressive. My pulse quickened as I grabbed the shotgun and crept toward the sliding glass doors leading to the woods. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, landing on the tree line. It was there. The creature stood motionless at the edge of the forest, its twisted frame illuminated in the pale light. It didn't move, didn't flinch, just stared. Then, before I could react, it took a step forward. My breath caught in my throat. Slowly, deliberately, it crossed the space between the woods and the house. I flipped on the outdoor floodlights, and for a moment I thought I had scared it off. But when I looked again, it was even closer. Standing just beyond the porch, I fired the shotgun, the deafening blast echoing through the night. The creature let out a screech that still haunts my dreams, a sound like a woman's scream twisted into something inhuman. It stumbled back, and then vanished into the woods. The dogs went berserk, and my parents came running, demanding to know what was happening. I lied, muttering something about a bear. How could I explain what I had seen? Who would believe me? For days I couldn't sleep. I avoided the woods, terrified of what might still be out there. Eventually, life returned to normal, or so I thought. Years later, while visiting my wife's family just a few miles from my parents' home, I felt it again. That same suffocating dread. We were walking her dog back from an old kennel near the woods when the smell hit me, rotting flesh. My wife made a joke about it, but I couldn't laugh. She noticed my unease and fell silent, her instincts sharp from a lifetime in the mountains. Then we heard it. From the direction of the kennel came a bark, a perfect imitation of the dog walking beside us. My wife froze, clutching my arm. The dog growled, turning to face the unseen threat. The air grew thick, and the darkness around us seemed to come alive. We didn't see it, but we knew it was there, watching, waiting. We ran. To this day, I don't know what that creature was, but one thing is certain: the Appalachian woods are ancient, and some things in those shadows were never meant to be understood. I was 11 years old when my dad and I moved to Hollow Ridge, a small, forgotten patch of the Appalachians tucked away in the foothills of Kentucky, the kind of place where silence hangs heavy and the hills seem alive with secrets. We moved into a double-wide trailer perched at the edge of a cul-de-sac. It was remote, flanked by endless woods on one side and the looming presence of the hills on the other. There were no neighbors behind or across from us, just shadowed forests that swallowed the sunlight by late afternoon. Living with us was my grandma, a superstitious woman who had lived her entire life in those hills. She had rules, strange ones, and she wasn't shy about making them known. Don't wander into the woods alone. Don't answer if you hear your name being called from the trees. And if you see someone out there, know you didn't. Come straight home. At 11, I chalked it all up to backwoods paranoia, the ramblings of an old woman too familiar with isolation. But one August night, I learned the hard way that her warnings weren't just stories. They were survival guides. It was a warm evening, the kind where the air clings to your skin like a wet blanket. Dad and I had mowed a narrow path through the tall grass and brambles next to the trailer, leading to a small clearing where we'd often camp out. It wasn't far, just far enough to feel like an adventure, but close enough to keep an eye on Grandma. That night the campfire crackled, sending sparks spiraling into the humid air. Dad decided to head back to the house to grab more beer and check on Grandma, leaving me alone by the fire. "Don't mess with the flames," he warned before disappearing into the shadows. For a while everything was fine. The forest buzzed with the usual symphony of crickets and frogs, the stream nearby murmuring softly. But then, all at once, the world went quiet. The kind of quiet that makes your skin crawl. The wind stilled, the insects silenced, and even the stream seemed to fade into the background. The air grew heavy, and then I noticed it, that sharp, metallic tang. It was faint at first, like the taste of blood in the back of your throat, but it grew stronger with every breath. I froze, staring into the flickering flames, trying to convince myself it was nothing, but my gut knew better. Minutes later, Dad returned, and the first thing he did was wrinkle his nose. "What the hell did you burn?" he snapped, glaring at the fire pit. "Nothing," I protested, pointing to the untouched cans by my side. He didn't argue further. Instead, his eyes darted to the darkening sky. "Storm's coming. Let's pack up." The hike back to the trailer was eerie. Lightning began to flicker through the clouds, illuminating the forest in sharp, unnatural flashes. With every bolt, the woods seemed to pulse with life, shadows dancing and twisting just beyond the edge of the trail. And then I saw it. In one flash of lightning, there it stood, at the edge of the woods, barely visible through the trees. A silhouette, humanoid but wrong. The darkness swallowed it as quickly as it had appeared, leaving me to wonder if I'd imagined it. But then came the next flash, and it was closer. Much closer. I stopped dead in my tracks, my breath caught in my throat. The metallic taste returned, stronger now, almost choking. My dad called my name from up ahead, but I couldn't move. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure, now standing side by side with the trees like it belonged there. Another flash. It was gone. I ran. I burst into the house, slamming the door behind me. My grandma turned from the sink, her face pale when she saw me. "What did you see?" she asked, her voice low and urgent. I stammered, unsure how to even describe it. She didn't wait for me to finish. Lock the doors. Shut the windows. Dad, slightly buzzed, didn't argue. That night I slept in Grandma's room, her Bible clutched in her hands as she whispered prayers under her breath. The next morning we found the tent in shreds. The fabric wasn't cut or clawed. It looked like it had been torn apart by sheer force, yanked to its limits until it gave. My uncle, who lived a mile away, reported that all 8 of his chickens were dead, their heads missing but no blood left behind. For weeks, the kids in the neighborhood, what few there were, weren't allowed outside alone. Even the school bus stop became a guarded affair, with parents standing watch in grim silence. Years later, when I was in my early 20s, I brought up that night at a family gathering. My cousins listened, wide-eyed, as I recounted the eerie silence, the metallic taste, and the shadowy figure in the woods. But when I got to the part about the figure, my aunt cut me off sharply. "Don't you dare tell them that," she hissed, her face ashen. "Don't you put that evil on them." That was the first time I heard the name. She muttered it under her breath like a curse. The Goat Man. I didn't fully understand then, but now I do. What I saw that night wasn't human, and it wasn't an animal. It was something else, something ancient and territorial. So, if you ever find yourself wandering through the foothills of Kentucky, remember this. If you hear your name from the woods, don't answer. If you see someone out there, know you didn't. And whatever you do, don't forget the rules. Because in places like Hollow Ridge, they aren't just warnings. They're the only thing keeping you alive.